Well, good evening. Call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for August 16th to order. Good evening, everybody. And we have two items on the agenda. And the first is a bicycle and pedestrian master plan process kickoff. So I'm going to turn it over to John and Damien and the consultant.
Well, thank you. As the mayor said, tonight we're going to be talking about the bicycle and pedestrian plan for the city of Ames. One of the outcomes of tonight we hope to do is get feedback and direction from city council on what you want for this plan, some of the desired outcomes. And obviously we're going to go through and give a very high level orientation to council on what the scope of the plan looks like, so that you're familiar with it and so you know what to expect going on into the future. And tonight our project manager is Adam Wood. Adam may look familiar to you. Tool Design also did our complete street plan, and Adam was the project manager on that. So seemed like a real good progression of the work that they've already done for our community to help us with this bike and pedestrian master plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
All right. Thanks, Damien. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me here tonight. I have a series of slides that you've probably all already had a chance to take a quick look at. I'm going to walk through those and hit on a few highlights, kind of going through a progression of talking a little bit about the elements of the project, the tasks that are in it, how it's kind of broken down into the work elements. Talk a little bit about vision and goals, and hear sort of what are your objectives for this project, and then tell you about our draft engagement plan, kind of where things are, and get some feedback on that. So as Damien said, I've been here before. I'm really excited to be back, kicking off this project on behalf of our entire team with Tool Design, and we have a sub-consultant in Fox Strand. Fox Engineering is based here in Ames. They were acquired recently by Strand Associates. I've worked with Strand Associates on a number of projects in the past, and so we're happy to be teaming with them, and they're going to support us in a lot of on-the-ground tasks. When we talk about active transportation planning and biking and walking and electric scooters and bike share and all of the various things, we're really in a period of rapid innovation, and that coincides with increased public acceptance and really public demand and support for investments in walking and biking. We're really moving away from a period of walking and biking being sort of niche alternative transportation. There's a term, alternative transportation. We had federal programs on transportation alternatives, and that terminology is really going away. And it's becoming integrated more as central parts of safe and equitable and multimodal transportation systems. And looking at how those can support community vitality, quality of life, your economy, and so forth as well. Damien mentioned the Complete Streets Plan, and this is a really good evolution of where that sets you up. A little bit about our background as a refresher. At Tool Design, we've been at the forefront of this evolution of helping communities to develop their bicycle and pedestrian plans and helping them to do it in a very cutting-edge way. I've worked personally on projects in San Jose, New Orleans, and even smaller communities like Brookings, South Dakota. We've performed research for the Federal Highway Administration. We've developed national best practice design guidance, been involved with some design projects like the image here. This is in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's the Capital City Bikeway. And so, we've really been excited about being at that forefront and bringing all of that here to Ames. One of the things that's changed a little bit about me since the last time you saw me is I've changed my role a little bit within the company. I'm now our active transportation plan practice lead, which means I work on projects all across the country, finding what are the best practices, what are the things we can do to improve the process and improve the outcomes. We've also had that experience here from the Complete Streets Plan to working with Iowa State University on identifying some opportunities and solutions for bikeway projects. And I also had the opportunity to take over project management of the Iowa DOT Long Range Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan several years ago. So I've probably spent more time in Ames than any other client city I've worked with over the last decade. So I'm happy to be back. All right, well, let's go on into talking about the project then. We have two main parts of this project within our scope of work. The first part is the bicycle and pedestrian plan, which has those elements of what are our goals, what are our existing conditions, what sort of connections do we want to make. And the second part is wayfinding. And this aligns with kind of two different funding streams that are supporting this project. In our scope of work, which is, our fancy way of saying our kind of detailed explanation about what we're doing in this project, we have 8 tasks, and this is how they're broken up. The bicycle and pedestrian plan has more tasks because there's a little bit more going on that side. There's more budget associated there. But some of those tasks, like the engagement, the project management, play double duty with the wayfinding as well. So I'm going to walk you through some of these tasks and give you a little bit more detail. So part 1, the bicycle and pedestrian plan. The task number 2 is public and stakeholder engagement. We're starting this task off with developing an engagement action plan, and that really is sort of the explanation of who are we trying to engage with, how are we going to do it, when are we going to do it in the life cycle of the project, how does that relate to our technical tasks, and so forth. And we're going to spend a fair bit of time later on in this meeting talking about that. I'll also at that point hit on the advisory committees, but just kind of have some things listed here. We're going to be developing branding for the project, a unique logo and identity. We have both online and in-person engagement identified, and we've really focused on strategies that we found over the course of the pandemic and how we're seeing things continue to evolve that are effective. We learned a lot of things during the pandemic. We learned that some methods we hadn't used before are actually methods people really respond to and react to better. But we've learned there's still a place for that in-person engagement. So we've worked both of those into the plan. We also are underway with our existing conditions task. And this is about getting a full picture and understanding of the past and current conditions within the community. We're engaging in a plan and policy review, including looking at some of the municipal code sections and identifying what are elements that need to be carried forward, where are the places for coordination with bike and pedestrian planning, where are there perhaps some areas for modification or adjustment, especially when it comes to some of the municipal code pieces. We're also going through a really detailed network evaluation task, which is where we get a lot of data and we analyze it in a variety of ways. And this is part of what we do on really projects all over the country. This is an image from Fort Collins, Colorado, which is an example of one of these levels of analysis. And this is a way for us to use data to augment what we learn from the community and what we see out there with our own eyes to come up with a really thorough understanding of needs. So on that evaluation, we're going to perform an activity snapshot, understanding what people are doing now, using some of those, quote unquote, big data sources that are out there that give us understandings of where people are coming from and going to and so forth. We'll perform a trip potential analysis, which looks at a variety of data sets to understand if we were to provide ideal conditions for biking and walking, where would we see the most use? And that sort of helps us to understand where do we want to make investments. A systemic safety approach, luckily you don't have a huge number of bicycle and pedestrian crashes. You have had some, but you have not had a huge number. It's hard to understand crash trends with a relatively small sample set. And that's where this concept of systemic safety comes from. As we look at those crashes and we understand what are the characteristics of the roadway and how might we identify other areas that may not have had crashes but have some of those similar characteristics. So we see that there's some potential risk there. We created a Safe Systems Priority Finder tool with USDOT that we use to do that. And it's a way we can do what used to be a very significant undertaking. We can do it for a smaller effort, so we can work it into projects in addition to some of these other elements. We also look at the level of traffic stress, both for pedestrian crossings and also for biking. That's what this image is. And it's a way of rating roadways by things like traffic volumes and speeds, how wide is it, is there a bike lane there or not, to sort of identify how comfortable or uncomfortable is it. A lot of times it shows you results that are really intuitive. You may see what we come up with Lincoln Way. You may see that and say, yeah, that's kind of obvious. That's the way it is. And part of the reason is to help communicate and explain that. And again, to show some streets where maybe they're on the borderline and could be made more comfortable by doing some small adjustments. That all feeds into a network analysis, which helps us to look at where our destinations and where can people access today. And also an equity analysis where we can go through each of these analyses and say, how does this relate to demographic characteristics? So we can see, do some neighborhoods have better or poorer access? And how does that relate to, say, income levels or where people of color live? Like, how are those relationships there? Are there inequities or are we at parity? Again, this is all giving us a good foundation of data so we can take the next step with community input to say, where are there investments we need to make? That's all going to culminate into a state of active transportation report here in the next couple of months. All right, so task 4 is the actual network plan. Luckily, I don't have as many words on this slide, but this is where we really fold in the vision and goals. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. We take that, we articulate it, we clarify it, we sort of put it in a strong framing that the rest of the plan is going to orient around. We're going to develop a framework for facility selection. We say facility, we mean, is it a bike lane, a buffered bike lane, a protected bike lane? Is it a side path on the side of the road? There's a lot of different ways of providing spaces for people to bike, and a lot of different ways for enhancing pedestrian spaces as well. Coming up with what's the right mix for Ames and how do we apply those and when? And it's about translating that vision into recommendations. And then ultimately that results in a network plan. Where are there connections that we want to make? Where are there existing connections we want to enhance? So on and so forth. Of course, the implementation is a critical aspect of that, and it's not all about infrastructure. We also, through evaluating plans and policies in your municipal code, want to look at, are there opportunities for any changes to policies, any changes to municipal codes, some programs that might be useful to help get more people out there biking, for example, or to make walking more safe and equitable. Again, this is going to come back to our goals. What are our goals? What are our vision? And then what are the policies and programs to help us get there? When it comes to the infrastructure, we want to help you identify the projects that are going to have the biggest bang for the buck. What are the ones that are really going to make the biggest difference? Prioritization is a key factor there. And phasing those projects is helpful as well for making it a feasible, sustainable investment strategy. We do have part of our contract with the city is to develop concept plans for some of the high priority projects. We need to define exactly what that's going to look like, but we envision that including some form of visual, graphic, maybe it's a cross section or a plan view, and identification of what is the correct or most appropriate type of facility, what are key issues, some planning level cost estimates and so forth that help you be set up for plans adopted. Now, how do we go ahead and start making some quick changes to our streets and our path network to get, really get things rolling. All right. And then let's go on to the next part, which is about wayfinding. Wayfinding is a bit of a jargony term. It is signs that tell you how to get to where you're trying to go. It is deceptively simple or deceptively difficult. I don't know what the right euphemism is right there. It seems simple to put signs up, but figuring out what should we put on the sign, where do we put the sign, how do we guide people can be a really complex element. So there's two parts to this, this element of the project. The first is developing that protocol. Sonia, I forgot to mention this earlier. There were images of two people on those slides. I do have two people that are critical to this project. There's multiple people critical to this project, but two in particular I wanted to point out. One is Sonia Heichel, who's in our Madison office. She is an expert company-wide for tool design in wayfinding and is going to be leading up the wayfinding element, these tasks. And then Sarah Schooley was the other person on this slide. She has a really interesting background. She was formerly the pedestrian coordinator for the city of Portland, Oregon. So has a lot of perspective there on walking and in a place that really is progressive and is really trying to be cutting edge in terms of walking and biking. So she's an expert in pedestrian planning, but also has a lot of really good background in engagement. So when we get to the engagement plan in a minute, that's a lot of her work. So sorry for that little sidebar, but jumping back into the wayfinding piece. So Sonia, this is going to be something she takes us through. The protocol itself is sort of the identification of what are the types of signs that we're going to have, what are the rules for where we put them, what do they look like, that sort of thing. It starts off with a discovery phase of understanding what's out there today, what sort of existing sign language do you have, are there elements of branding that we want to incorporate, are there, perhaps like regional trail elements that should be tied in, like various things like that. So that's sort of like understanding what the universe is that's out there right now. Defining our best practices and principles and seeing how those relate specifically here to Ames and to the wayfinding system that will happen here. That destination hierarchy is really critical. We can't put every single destination on the signs. We've got to figure out what we prioritize and where. Designing the signs and figuring out where we place them, so on and so forth. So we're going to develop this whole protocol. And this gives you a really clear manual and ground rules and kind of how-to guide for developing out the wayfinding system. But we're not going to leave you just with the book. We also, for task 8, we're going to develop some prototype sign plans for up to about 4 miles of bikeways. This is an image of sort of an example of what that could look like, where we will actually identify the signs, what's going to go on them, where they should be placed, and so forth, and work with city staff to kind of test those out. We may, work on creating some signs as examples to see how they look and testing them and everything. And then that cycles back into that protocol to help wrap that up. So that's a, overview of the pieces. To talk briefly about the schedule, we've already kicked off in June. We see this taking a little bit less than a year to complete. You can see the bottom half of the chart here shows our kind of 4 main technical tasks of existing conditions, network plan, implementation strategies, and then the plan documents themselves, and how those sort of align in are kind of a linear in order. And then highlighted in green are the 3 main phases of public and stakeholder engagement. And those arrows are just sort of indicating that those are relating to sort of getting feedback on what we've learned, but also helping to guide the next stage. So from our existing conditions analysis, that'll inform how we engage with stakeholders during phase 1. We'll tell them things, they'll tell us things, and what they tell us will help to shape the network plan. Similarly, we'll take the network plan back for testing during phase 2. We'll hear some things, we'll get some input on how we move forward in implementation. So there's sort of a back and forth that happens there. The wayfinding element is going to be a little bit of a shorter duration. We will have a bit of work in September to do some initial discovery and some initial discussions with advisory committees, but the bulk of that work is going to happen between November and March. And that aligns pretty well with the overall schedule, as well as with some of the engagement phases that we'll talk about in the next section. Okay. All right, so let's talk about vision and goals. What do you want out of this project? Hopefully these diagrams made a little bit of sense when you looked at these previously. One of the things that I think is easy to get hung up on when we talk about goals in the context of a plan is whether we're talking about goals for the plan, goals for the project, versus the goals we hope to achieve as a result of the work we're doing. So when we talk about goals for the project, they can include things like what's shown there on the left. We want to make sure we're engaging students. We want to make sure we have a clear list of priorities that come out of this plan. We want to make sure it's less than 100 pages so people will actually look at all sorts of things like that, right? Then we actually develop the plan, and the plan should be tailored in such a way that it helps us with those outcomes of, for example, letting everyone be able to bike to work or school, to eliminate traffic deaths, to make it to where any kid can get to school safely, whatever those outcomes may be. So it's kind of the general framework. I like to break this down and make vision and goals and everything relate to each other in a particular way. And there's a method to this madness, and I know this may look a little complex. The reason is I very strongly believe, and there's a lot of evidence I've seen over my career, that when we have goals that are very clearly outcome oriented, and they tie and we can relate them to the analyses that we perform, and we can have prioritization criteria that relate to those goals and performance measures, that we can then give you a plan that has very actionable elements that can help you achieve the vision you're trying to get to. So that's why we have this sort of structure here. The vision is simply a description. This is essentially saying, here's where we want to be in the future. What I really like to do is divide that very concisely into a set of goals. I think 3 to 5 goals is the right number. If we need more than 5, I think that's where objectives and principles can come into play. The goals should be, it's kind of that elevator pitch. What are the key things we're trying to achieve? Objectives or principles or values, and really the difference there is in how we phrase those statements. Those are things that help us to identify how we're going to achieve those goals. And the performance measures then are ways we can see, are we moving the needle? Is what we're doing working? So if we have a goal to eliminate traffic fatalities, one of the principles may be, or one of the objectives may be to, decrease fatalities by 10% a year or something along those lines. And the performance measure would then be, the fatality rate. So that way we can see, are we making adjustments, as one example. And we can really start anywhere in this framework. We can start with the vision and then develop the goals. We can start with the goals and then work up and back and so forth. So, something to keep in mind. And this is a thing we're going to be working. We're going to talk with you tonight, but we're going to be working through the public process as well to get feedback on this to help us shape it. In working in a variety of places, again, from multi-million population cities down to very small communities, what we found is that when it comes to active transportation planning, bike plans, pedestrian plans, so forth, the best practice is really to include at least these three goals as being central to the work. One is safety. I think we want it to be safer for all transportation users. And in a project like this, we're particularly talking about biking and walking. We want to make sure that we're doing something to increase mode share. That's a fundamental purpose for investing in biking and walking. You're not going to build sidewalks and build bike lanes unless you want people out there using them, right? So we're wanting to increase the amount of use. And that can be framed in different ways. If you want to frame it more about reducing carbon footprint, we can do that. One way to reduce carbon footprints to get people driving less and biking and walking more, so that the goal can be framed in that way. And then equity is a critical piece as well. And of course, that relates to race and ethnicity. It also relates to income. But age and ability are important pieces as well. And you may have heard the phrase all ages and abilities. That's a concept that really came out of the Dutch biking culture of creating bikeways that are safe for people from ages 8 to 80, people with physical disabilities, people without physical disabilities, and so forth. So these are kind of three main things, and you can see some of the related pieces there. A lot of communities want to have goals around reducing costs or so forth. And again, safety, if you improve safety, that's a way you can reduce societal costs. Biking has less wear and tear on the roadway than driving does. There's all sorts of ways we can talk about integrating some of those additional goals into this framework. This is an example, and I like to show this one because it's, I think, a really good visual representation of how vision and goals, and in this case, targets, can relate to each other. This is Cambridge, Massachusetts, which may in some ways feel like a world away, but I was the project director on this 2020 bike plan, and Cambridge is also a relatively small city with a major university or two, so there are some potential parallels we can draw here. But you can see here they have a fairly succinct vision. They have three goals, and then they have targets that are specific and measurable about mode share, percentages, children walking and biking to school, 0 fatalities, and so forth. So if it's okay with you, what I'd like to do is take a little bit of a breather and stop talking for a minute and hear from you about your goals for this project, for the outcomes, and maybe get some reaction to the idea of some of these best practices that I sort of put out there about safety and mode share and equity. If there's anything you think is maybe lacking from that sort of three-legged stool of goals, and just kind of hear your reactions.
Well, that's good. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'll start, I guess. I was curious, just kind of looking through the presentation so far, the public input mechanism seemed mostly focused at the tasks 1 through 6 under that bike ped master plan. But I think it would be valuable too to have wayfinding, and maybe just do it during that part, but have them ask about wayfinding too, because I think our citizens probably have some of the best ideas of where tricky wayfinding spots are. And I mean, I could think of some, and I'm sure we could think, but I think crowdsourcing that sort of information would be really valuable. And so that was something that I just want to mention, that I want to make sure that the wayfinding isn't lost in that input piece, or the stakeholder feedback piece. But I mean, I like the goals, and you're right in that it seems like they sort of fall into place. So I don't object to the 3 that I heard. So I'm curious if other council members have any more that would stand out other than those. I mean, safety, of course, increasing use. I mean, looking back at Cambridge, as they said, they wanted 10% of trips by 2020 to be on bicycle. When did they come up with that plan, and how did they do? Do you have any idea? Is that real? Is that a real
They
plan?
have increased. So they had a 2015 plan, and then we updated it in 2020. It was supposed to be a 2020 adoption, and then COVID happened and things
Oh.
got thrown out of whack a little bit. So it really wasn't adopted until early 2021. They did not hit the 10%, but they did increase. They did get better. And they've very aggressively been building separated bike lanes on a lot of their streets. They've made a lot of hard decisions with removing parking. And if you know Cambridge, you know there's not a whole lot of real estate there. On-street parking is pretty closely guarded. So they've made some tough investments there, but they've been really successful, I think, in implementing a system and causing a good shift in the travel patterns that are happening.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would love to see that, that our usage number increase. Just, what are the elements that get us there? So, yeah, I'd love to hear from others too, though.
I had a question about how and whether you do some work around culture. So helping the city get excited about and want to move towards more bike and pedestrian avenues.
Yeah, and I think that sort of in my head fits in sort of the policy and program aspect. It is a critical piece. One of the I mentioned San Jose, California earlier, and one of the things we did in that project was a pretty broad literature review to look for examples of where communities have moved the needle on things like mode shift and equity in particular. And there is an aspect of you have to put the infrastructure out there. If you don't have the infrastructure, you're not going to get that change. The more infrastructure you have, the more people will walk and bike. There's a safety in numbers aspect, and the safer it is for everyone. So that's a piece of it. But there was also definitely a strong culture piece. And especially when we look at trying to get more representation, more diversity in who's out there walking and biking, there, for a variety of reasons, are hesitations there, and creating those the feeling of comfort and confidence and willingness to walk and bike more is certainly supported by having kind of culture shift aspects that can help people find their place, find how walking and biking is for them, to see themselves out there. So that's something we certainly look forward to exploring and thinking about what are some of those pieces. The fundamental question, and as far as the plan, is how do we work that in? Whose charge is it to lead those culture shifts, and sort of what are those levers we can pull and so forth?
Thank you.
Maybe one thing I would add to that, we recently had a phone call with Sarah, who was previously mentioned. And one of the things she said that her passions was when she was Portland bike ped coordinator, she said that she worked a lot with the elementary schools and younger students to really start at an early age getting comfortable with walking and biking. Because I mentioned during that phone call, I said one of the things that I'd like to see from the plan was starting earlier, so that people are created habits, that they're comfortable with it. So if there's really any kind of thing that this group could help guide our community on, would be what barriers, if you're younger, if you want to go to school, so that you don't have to wait till you're an adult and more confident in your walking and your biking habits, that especially parents are also comfortable with supporting that activity. That I was really happy to hear that Sarah, that was one of her primary roles when she worked in Portland. So.
Thank you.
Building off that experience, I think it's going to be good for us.
Mm-hmm.
So as we start this process, I want to just sort of acknowledge that we're not starting from scratch. And so John and Damien, thank you for the investment you made. One of the reasons I ran for city council was this issue. And it has been a delight to work with both of you and to see your forward thinking, your interest in best practices, your concern with safety, your desire to invest in capital. We spend, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, John, about $1.5 million a year on our bike infrastructure. I'm very proud of the city's commitment. There are very few cities in the country our size that have that level of capital investment. And really, we owe a lot of this to you for the bike infrastructure system we have. Part of the challenges, and Adam, you really sort of, I think, really did a great job in your opening comments about the shift that's taken place in this area. And Ames is probably a good example of this. So we have problem areas in our community that are there because prior councils didn't have a commitment to this. And I don't want to just throw rocks at people, but it wasn't part of the culture. So when Lincoln Way was developed, when South Duff was developed, bike safety wasn't even part of the conversation, obviously. And so one of the things that I am particularly interested in that I think you are uniquely capable of bringing to us is solving all of our problems. Can you do that for us? No? Okay. But maybe but seriously though, helping us to think through some of our problem areas, just a fresh set of eyes, I think will be really valuable. So we have some great components to our bike infrastructure, but we have challenges with respect to connectivity. So you're going along this great trail and all of a sudden, and it's ending. What do I do now? I turn around and go back. And so I think there are a lot of pieces in place. And so I think helping us with connecting, but solving some of these problem areas, I think is going to be really vital. One other thing that we haven't talked about at all, I've had a number of people reach out and ask about mountain biking. And so we've been looking primarily at transportation, but there's also, I don't know if that's something that fits in this or that's something that's purely in Parks and Rec, but there's a part of our community that's really interested in single track mountain biking. And so is that something that's irrelevant to this discussion, or can that be something that is also considered? So those are a couple things that I want to throw out. And maybe one question, if there are cities that are our size and that you think have done a really good job of this, that might be something to send to council just to get us thinking about what have they been successful in and giving us sort of, this is, we're going to go through this process and this is what you can have to look forward to. You're going to see these types of improvements. So welcome, and we're excited to work with you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I just wanted to expand on what you said about connectivity. I know it's under increased mode share, but I think it's such a big issue that it might be its own pillar or goal for us. And connectivity, not just within the city of Ames, but also within Iowa State, within the county, connecting kind of our whole regional network, I think should be a big goal.
Others?
I just had one more thought too. It was about what Tim said about the amount of funding we've dedicated every year to bike and ped infrastructure for Ames. And that level, I mean, we set that was one of the first few years I was on council. So, I mean, I think, and that's more of a discussion for council, but we really need to look at that and consider if that's enough anymore, because of course everything costs more now too. And, but that'll have to be something we think about, but I'm curious if there's any advice out there in terms of percentages of overall transportation system funding that would be a common practice or something like that we could look for as maybe a target amount of funding that we are dedicating to that?
One thing I know that they are scoped to do, and I think we mentioned early on in this process, like why we wanted to create a bike and ped master plan for Ames versus it being a product within the MPO, where I was talking about the MPO as a fiscal constraint process where you cut off the future when you're 25 years out. And you're really constrained by the way the DOT wants you to do your budgeting. So they don't let you pick scenarios of budgeting. They say, well, what have you been budgeting? So they're very prescriptive. And that was kind of a frustration that I think we had as staff because it felt like you eliminated a lot of potential options. So this plan isn't constrained in that way. And so we'll have obviously a lot more of a network. I mean, it could be 50. I'm just making this up at this moment. You could have essentially like a 50-year network based upon our current funding. And then when we get closer to iterations of the plan and we present council with information, you will be able to look at what that funding's at and make decisions along those lines and say, well, if we want this to happen faster than what our current funding level is, And the other thing too that I thought was important, that I really liked that Adam said early on in the presentation, I think it helped guide that, if I don't choke, which was that the item where he was talking about the kind of uncaptured trip potential. So there could be a certain amount of trips, activities related into the community that we should be seeing, walking and biking activity. So that might help us inform, is our current level of investment enough to be able to capture those walking and biking trips that we're not? Do we need to make an investment, or could it be done through the educational pieces? There's a lot of different strategies I hope to see as this project progresses.
Yeah, it fundamentally, there's a relationship between how much should you spend and where do you want to be. And I think that's sort of the question that we're wanting to hear, or we're wanting to get input on. I always remember, if anyone is looking for reading, I can't remember the name of the book, but I'm sure there's multiple ones, but read up on how Amsterdam became such a biking centric city. They were as auto oriented as any American city was back in the 1970s. They went through a very intentional process of changing their goals and their investment and so forth, and made it easier for people to bike. And so many people bike in Amsterdam because that's the easy way to get around, and people will do what is easy. People ride the subway in Manhattan, not because they love the smell of it, but because it's the most convenient and easy way to get around, right? So that's a critical part of getting more people biking and walking. If you wanted to say you want 20% of all of your trips by biking and walking by the year 2040, we can tell you, okay, here's what you're going to need to get there, and here's how much it's going to cost you. Or if you want to say we want to spend X million dollars per year, we can help you figure out where that will get you. But understanding, how aggressive do you want to be as a community is sort of one of the things we're trying to feel out right now.
So I appreciate that point, Bronwyn. It's sort of unfortunate from a timing perspective that this work is going to be done after our budget cycle. So it may be that council would want to think through, just because we're making this movement, that would we want to increase funding for bike infrastructure in this next capital improvement plan? I would be very open to your thoughts on that. So, and maybe we don't allocate as, I want to make sure that we give room to hear your thoughts, but I also feel badly about not taking advantage of this budget cycle and not making some level of investment. One other thing I wanted to mention, when we think about bike infrastructure, it's oftentimes in terms of the blacktop or concrete, but there's also an important role for lighting. And one of the areas that I think we made a tremendous improvement on is on Mortensen. So along the middle school, it was like going into a black hole. It was terrifying. There was no light down there. Totally not safe. And the university was a good partner. So you probably know that we've got this interesting partnership with Iowa State. So we have these institutional relationships. And so we're going to have to navigate that as well. But Iowa State stepped up and put in lighting along there. That made a world of difference along there. And so Iowa State was really a great partner. And I hope that they're going to continue to be a great partner as we work through this, because we can't make this kind of plan without Iowa State's vital involvement.
Yeah, that's a good point. Are they specifically included in the feedback process?
There's membership already of ISU staff that we work with on a regular basis on our technical committee.
Okay.
And then we're also going to have on the community advisory committee, other student representation, Iowa State representation.
Gloria, did you have any questions?
Mayor,
Yes.
Mayor, can I ask some questions or make some observations, please?
Absolutely.
I'm hearing an awful lot about bicycle infrastructure and not nearly as much about pedestrian aspects of this planning process. And I'm hoping that we aren't going to lose sight of the fact that there are many people in the community who do not ride bikes and maybe who even can't afford to own a bicycle. And so I think that the pedestrian side of the bike pedestrian planning process is an important one for us to consider. And it's also a little bit more challenging because sidewalks are supposed to be the responsibility of the property owners to put in. And so I'm hoping that we as a community can get some recommendations on ways that we can more effectively enhance the sidewalk infrastructure within the community, maybe working with property owners. And that leads me to a question about the kind of policy review that's going to occur. Are you going to be looking at things like what requirements we have for putting in sidewalks and bike trails? Are you going to be looking at the ways in which we can fill those gaps? Are we going to get an analysis of the sidewalk system and where the gaps actually exist in the community? Tim was talking about the gaps in the bike trails. We've got a lot of gaps in the sidewalk system as well. And along with that, I'm also wondering with the wayfinding if there are going to be recommendations regarding pedestrian sign protocols as well. And I'll leave it there and wait for the answers.
That reminds me of a good question too.
You want to respond to that first, and then we'll go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I thank you for making the point about the pedestrian aspect. Quite often, a bicycle and pedestrian plan is about 80 or 90% focused on bikes. We've seen this in numerous cases. I think that there are a few reasons for that, but I do try to make things a bit more balanced on projects. There are certainly gaps in your sidewalk system. We have some really good data already to help identify where those gaps are. And I think through some of the analyses we talked about, we can very easily identify the ones that are probably the highest priority based on a variety of factors. So prioritizing closing some of those sidewalk gaps is certainly in the scope of possibility for this work. I think it's also, though, really important to recognize you do have a lot of sidewalks relative to a lot of American cities. Where the challenge often lies is in getting across the street. That's where the safety concerns really are. That's usually what's least comfortable and so forth. And one of the tasks that we have is to perform a data-driven evaluation of intersections to find ones that are likely to be less comfortable, higher stress crossings. And we can look at, identifying sort of packages of treatments to apply to some of those to help prioritize improvements on intersections. That's a really important point. So thanks for bringing that up. Yes, we, in looking at requirements, municipal code and so forth, will certainly look for those places where there are perhaps less than optimal or just, things we should evaluate in terms of installation and who's responsible for different parts of the infrastructure. I think that's something also that we'll look to Damien to help point us to any places where that's recorded if we don't have access to it currently. And then, yes, the wayfinding piece will certainly look at pedestrian use as well. Part of that protocol development is identifying those sign types. There may be signs that are functional both for people walking and biking. There may be value for separated signs for people walking versus people biking. Our intent is not to have any signs that are dedicated for driving. You have some of those already. Iowa State has some signs, that help people get to campus. That's not what we're focusing on here. But then, to a previous comment as well, we do have, and we'll talk about it in the next section, identified how wayfinding will be integrated in with the public engagement component as well, and how we'll be talking with people about that.
I think she also asked, is there an inventory going to be done on the sidewalks? Is that part of the scope of the work?
We have, so one of the data sources that we provide to the consultant is we have like planimetric data, which essentially tells the difference between like grass, hard surfaces. So we have, and that's done through LiDAR and imagery. So we have a pretty robust GIS data, as council knows, that they can do an analysis on that to see. But it's not necessarily like a full-blown walking survey of where all the sidewalk is, but we would have a very just shy of 100% accurate information. I mean, it's not going to be 100%, but we will know where streets are substantially lacking in sidewalks versus ones that have it. And same with what Adam was saying too. One of the critical piece in that evaluation would be intersections that are below a standard of crossing treatment that we want or crossing protection that we would want to see. So those kind of evaluations, I think, are going to be critical as well.
And that's just as part of Gloria's question, but I think maybe it was, and that is, will you be identifying areas where maybe there aren't sidewalks? I mean, I don't mean in every neighborhood, but where you would suggest or recommend they should be added or implemented in order to do both a bike and ped master plan?
Yes, using the data Damien referenced, which is in very good condition. We've looked at the data and it's good quality. One of the things that we as a company have a lot of capabilities in is in very robust data analysis and taking information like that and in a relatively quick way, sort of doing an inverse on that and identifying where there are street segments that don't have those existing sidewalks, essentially. So it's identifying, street segments without sidewalks, and that can be compared with things like population density and are there destinations nearby and all of that to sort of identify, maybe which ones are more critical gaps in the network versus those that are gaps but are not near destinations, not near schools, not near higher density population, and so forth.
So since you're on the goals for the project, it would seem that based on her question, it would be also focusing on pedestrian as well as the bike element. So, Brian, did you have something else you wanted to?
Well, what Gloria mentioned reminded me. I see a lot of folks in the audience who have given us comments on safety elements in different parts of town, and so I'm wondering, for their sake to hear too, for the public input, like do you have sort of a record of what people have brought to us? I mean, I have sort of a mental record of areas of town that are risk areas or sort of problem areas that people have brought to us in the past year or so. But are these folks going to have to come again to give their input? That's my question is, they've said it once, but like, are we expecting that during the public engagement process, that's when we really start to collect it all? Obviously we'll have some chances to name a few problem areas, but same with getting the sort of crowdsourced data on wayfinding, same with the sidewalk health too. I think a lot of people who live in the neighborhoods are probably our best source of information for like that sort of sidewalk inventory or sidewalk health measures. So does that come in the public engagement piece?
One thing I can add, and I'll let Adam speak to the public engagement. Kind of like as Tim mentioned earlier, we're not starting from nothing. So we have at least like last 3 long-range plan processes where we had, if you recall, we have an issues envisioning workshop during that plan. And usually the consultant working on it will put together essentially a PDF summarizing all the issues for a walking and biking network. So we can, obviously we will share that with Adam. I think we did when we did the complete street plan or something similar to it. But some of that data or feedback from the public is probably 3, 4, 5 years old now. So we're not starting with nothing. And I think it is a good thing to take the past feedback and hear new feedback. It kind of helps reinforce that those areas are priorities that need to be fixed. The good thing is, I remember when we did the last long range plan, there was probably half a dozen to a dozen significant street segments where we've done a project that was an issue, is no longer an issue. So we'll also be able to give that kind of feedback to Adam when they're developing the plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd also mention that one of the tasks we performed for ISU was, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, we created an online interactive map and asked people to identify barriers, opportunities, connections they would like to see. This was a project for ISU. We did not put a hard boundary on it, and people provided comments all over the city and outside of the city as well. So we have a lot of that data. It is perhaps out of date in some areas. The South Grand Avenue extension to 16th Street didn't exist back there. There's places that there were gaps that you've closed already. So, we take that with a grain of salt. But
I like that idea, though. Could we do that again? Online interactive map where people, during the feedback process, is that planned, or is that?
I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. Yeah.
And what's one more piece on, oh, go ahead, Gloria.
Sorry, we do have some additional data that was collected for us by the community and regional planning program students who were partnering with us on community engagement. And they collected some data on where people did not feel safe on the roads. I think that was last fall that they collected that data. So we have that. And we also have, I believe, a report from about 2 years ago that was done by one of the Smart Cities classes that looked at intersections and the safety of some of the intersections in the community as another part of helping Ames to be a smarter city. So I'm sure that we can arrange to share those documents with Damien and make sure that they are part of the mix.
Tim?
Yeah, just real quickly, I know we're going to talk more about community involvement, but here tonight, we know we have a lot of people from the Ames Bicycle Coalition, and I think you worked with them on the Complete Streets. And so could you talk about how you work with bicycle advocacy groups in other communities?
Sure. Yeah. There's a few different approaches that we take depending on the size and scale of the advocacy organization. Is there more than one advocacy organization? What's our overall structure of the way we're trying to engage with stakeholders? One of the things that we want to make sure we're doing is getting diverse engagement and making sure we're hearing from people from the disability community. We often engage with local AARP or and various organizations like that. We have an opportunity with a community advisory committee to include representatives there along with other organizations. We often will have small group or focus group meetings, which are opportunities for engaging with individual organizations. And we've had some where we've had sort of recurring meetings, 2 or 3 or 4 meetings over the course of a project where we've sought and gotten feedback as well. I think that there's a lot of value in having organizations sort of intermix when they're providing input to sort of cross-pollinate and share, concerns and issues and find, areas where there's actually a lot of common ground and sort of some symbioses that can occur, with different objectives. I think that's a really powerful way of not only informing the plan, but actually helping to strengthen, the roles of organizations and how they engage with each other. So
Great, thank you.
I know that you've been asking us or council to identify some goals. So I think in a minute, I'd like to have council, identify any other goals that you want to talk about, they want to include. But a few questions. One is, I don't think I understand that the wayfinding is strictly limited to bike and pedestrian. Is that correct?
that's correct.
In my opinion, I think that we suffer from wayfinding, and not just in bike and pedestrian, but just as a city in general. So as we think about that, if you could give some input in terms of, or think about how we could improve that. Iowa State does a pretty good job of putting their signs up, I think, in terms of some of our entrances and other things, helpful to kind of, make it seem like it's all, linked together. Can you talk about bike and pedestrian? I don't know if you're aware, but Iowa State's not really interested in scooters. I'm not sure this council has talked about it a little bit. We also have, bike share. Can you talk about micro mobility and how that ties in with, that consideration? Or when you say bike, it basically brings all those into the mix also, or does it affect your thinking differently?
So this is one of those areas of change and innovation, and I don't know that anyone has 100% solidly figured out how we categorize things. We worked with the city of Pittsburgh to develop what was called a Bike Plus plan, and I think it was one of the first, if not the first, active transportation plans to really fully integrate micromobility, electric bikes, and so forth into the mix. There are different perspectives on the role and validity even of some of these devices. I live in Wisconsin, and electric scooters are technically illegal within the state. There are a variety of one-wheeled skateboard, electric, like there's all sorts of devices that are being created and put out there that have a fairly wide range of operational parameters. I mean, if you think about cars, there's all sorts of different models of cars, but they all generally go in the same direction. Most of them have four wheels, they have turn signals, things along those lines. And they, we have speed limits and so forth. Enforcing speed limits on bike lanes or on paths is something I think is a incredibly difficult challenge, and is not what I would say is the solution that really addresses the problem or the challenge. I will say, I think this period of innovation, especially as we talk about mode shift goals and we talk about the increasing accessibility of low cost electrified devices, can stand to really change people's travel patterns. I think, there's unfortunately the latest bill from Congress included subsidies for electric cars, but not subsidies for electric bikes. However, last year there were, forget the statistic, 3 or 4 times more electric bikes sold in the United States than there were electric cars. There's a huge opportunity, if the costs come down, for people to replace trips under 1 mile or 2 miles or 3 miles with these devices. So there is an opportunity. There's obviously a lot of concern if someone's going 30 miles per hour down a path where there's somebody walking with their kid in a stroller. There are obviously concerns there, and so I think it's a sticky point. I think it's something we are aware of, that you're interested in exploring, and we're certainly constantly thinking about this as well, and working in different communities trying to figure out what's the right mix in each place.
I think one thing I might add to that is that we talked a little bit about tonight about transportation, recreation, different like trail types, different walking path types. Kind of the good and the bad, if you want to think about it that way, about Ames is that our network works for a wide range of speeds, a wide range of uses. So we overlap in probably 90+% of a recreation and transportation uses. They kind of work for both, or they can work for both. I think one of the things that we're going to I will lean on a tool for, is what kind of thresholds do we need to start managing the separation between walking, between micromobility, between bikes. If they're low volume enough, it feels like people walking, when a scooter comes along, especially if that person is respectful of the person walking, there's not a problem. But when you get to a certain density, a certain differential in speed, kind of the same issues that apply for any transportation mode, when do those conflicts happen? And then when do we have to adjust our planning so that maybe we need a separate facility, or maybe we do need to start focusing on speed limits? But there's a lot of places in town where some of those volumes are lower that we can, I hate to put it this way, but you can kind of get away with mixing those modes, mixing those types of travel. But it's where are the problem areas, where the conflicts happen, that we need to either use signage, we either need to look for regulatory options. That's really what I think this plan can help identify. Even if we don't have that particular issue right now, we can kind of be mindful of when those thresholds would kick in.
As you mentioned, recreation, that's one of our questions I had was, can you talk about recreation, tourism potential, and economic development? I mean, I heard, a presentation a few years ago, B&B, you see bread and breakfast. Now it's bikes and breweries, and that really is a huge, draw. And the county's been doing a good job of, investing in some, bike trails and trying to get some connected to heart of Iowa and recreation. Is that woven into this consideration too, in terms of how it would connect or how it could promote more for, recreational use? I understand there's, getting to work and shopping, et cetera, but also, and getting to school, but is that also, woven in, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's certainly an important consideration. We don't have in our contract to perform any sort of like market analysis around tourism potential or anything to that degree. But there is certainly a role there. I think it's also the counterpart of that is how the ability to bike and walk is sort of I kind of hate to use this term sometimes, but sort of an amenity that's kind of a quality of life amenity type of piece that is attractive not just to tourists but also to people that live here. And there are numerous surveys that have been performed around the country asking, what people want in communities, and that ability to walk and bike is really high, not only from a health and recreation and exercise perspective, but also just in not having to get in your car, not having to deal with the stresses of all of that as well. So I think, all of those sort of facets are part of the equation, and they're part of considerations. And I think as we start looking at the network and we look at opportunities, I know, there are regional trails that we need to connect in. You have, depending on your perspective, either great or terrible gravel roads, depending on what kind of bike you ride out here, that a lot of people would want to connect to. And I for anyone listening at home, I say terrible. A lot of roadies don't like the gravel roads. I live in Wisconsin; everything's paved, which is kind of annoying sometimes. I would love to have some gravel roads to ride on, but there's sort of mixes and perspectives there. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and making those connections in the network is critical, as well as sort of the rationale of why we're doing this and what are the values that can result from these investments.
And the last question is on the bike racks, service areas, or these kind of things that you would offer input. I mean, if you go biking in some places, they have, really nice columns that have, tools, air pump, et cetera, et cetera. Is that something you offer input or feedback on to kind of help encourage people that if you get a flat tire, you got a place where you can get it pumped up or have some tools or access? And I think bike racks are really lacking in the community as well too, but I don't know how that all fits into your planning and recommendations.
Yeah, that's a great point. We often refer to those as end of trip facilities or support facilities or something along those lines. I would say that when we talk about biking from a transportation perspective, and that's not just commuting to work, that's also being able to bike to the store, that's being able to bike to the coffee shop, that's being able to bike with your kid to school or whatnot. If you don't have a safe place to lock your bike up, you're not going to do that. And that's such a foundational piece of it. Just like if you can imagine there were no parking lots and no on-street parking, but you had streets, like you would never be able to get out of your car because you couldn't park it anywhere. Like we need to have a place for you to be able to park your bike. We've worked with numerous communities on identifying parking standards for bike parking standards, placement of racks, sort of how many racks per square footage of different types of facilities and so forth. We don't have a explicit identified task item in this contract to come up with that detailed, but certainly basic guidance or basic recommendations on those pieces would be something we could easily incorporate, and pointing to some guidance that's already out there. One of the things is that I always want to point out is there's a lot of really good design guidance out there that just because it says Massachusetts Department of Transportation on it doesn't mean you can't use it. So we can help to point to some good guidance that's already out there that you can take on is what directs some of your decision making.
We'll see if we can wrap up this goal segment. Does council want to add any more goals or either to the project, the future outcomes, or things you want to see in the plan? Okay.
Well, thanks. Well, so we are, not going to set any goals in stone coming right out of this. We still are going to go through our process of community engagement but this is really helpful in not only getting your, lowercase g goals for what we do here and for this project, but also some direction that we can build upon for the actual plan goals. And as I said, that's really helpful because the more we shape our plan around some strong goals, prioritization around those strong goals, the more we can create plans that are a plan that will help you achieve your vision.
So will you be following up, or Damien be following up with a summary of what was talked about right now? So, and then get that to council so they can look it over and make sure that we're all on the same page, so you don't get halfway down your, your process and, oh, we thought we weren't going to do this.
Yeah. So one of the things too is we were talking with Adam is moving forward, and he'll have a slide in here on like the major presentation steps, milestones along the way that we'll present to council, be back here in person to present to council, but also that we'll have either some kind of project memo or some other kind of communication to council that you would see in your packets on a monthly basis that would be able to give you information about what is going on with the project, in addition to the website or some of the other places where the public can stay engaged with it. But I would think that before you would see what he gave an example for Cambridge, like that level of kind of a formal, thought out goals, targets and such, that would come sometime after we have the public engagement process. So we'll give a draft of that. Obviously, you'll get a summary of this meeting, but the more formal statement that you would see in the plan at the beginning of the plan, correct me if I'm wrong, will come most likely after the public engagement process.
That was my question, was not everything with the T's crossed and I's dotted, but basically a summation of the general topics that were talked about, and then get that woven into goals.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And we like to kind of create the main bones of a plan and get feedback prior to actually writing everything and zipping it all up into a final document. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about the public engagement process. We have kind of a set of goals that we started with early on, and really before we were even under contract with the city, about sort of what are the goals that we have for the process itself. Obviously, we want to be COVID conscious, and that relates not only to if there are significant changes in the status, if we need to go back all virtual again, if we don't do indoor, whatever may happen there, but also just understanding people's different levels of comfort with engaging in person. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the level of familiarity and comfort a lot of people have gotten with some of these asynchronous engagement. That's a term that I learned during COVID with my kids in school, is asynchronous. That was one I didn't know before. But these asynchronous engagement opportunities where people can provide their input whenever it's convenient for them. Interagency coordination is really critical. I think you all have done a really good job in working with the Story County and with DOT and with the MPO on projects that sort of span your areas of jurisdiction. So making sure that that's a key part of our engagement. Having our committee presentation, the Technical Advisory Committee and Community Advisory Committee participation be authentic, and making sure that we're giving real opportunities for input that can shape the plan. Trying to really focus on diversity in participation, from race and ethnicity to age to people that bike, people that don't bike, people that might be interested in biking, people that walk regularly, people that don't, making sure we're getting a lot of different perspectives there. And then making sure that the strategies are equitable and inclusive. And so that plays a little bit into when and where we and how we've drafted this plan. So what in the elements of the plan, and I will say this is kind of our preliminary working draft. Sarah, that we've mentioned earlier, met with people from Ames Public Schools and Iowa State earlier last week to kind of run through this material in a little bit more detail and get some feedback, make a few little tweaks, and has asked for some guidance and direction on particular ways to engage with student bodies on both sides of that. That said, we've sort of broken down the engagement audiences into general public, the Technical Advisory Committee, and the Community Advisory Committee. So kind of three main elements in the plan. And we've broken it into 3 phases. And you might remember my chart earlier with the arrows pointing up and down to those 3 bars. So we have 3 public input phases. And in this series of slides, you'll see the top row there is how we're going to be what we're going to be seeking and how for the bike and pedestrian plan. And then the bottom row is pertaining to wayfinding. So during this first phase that we're going to plan on kicking off in September, running through October, is really about raising awareness. We want people to know we're doing this project. What is bicycle and pedestrian planning? What is a pedestrian? What does that mean? We're talking about people walking. We will, through this, really try to use more common language terms as far as possible. We'll also be using this as an opportunity to understand community values, to shape those goals, taking your input, all of that sort of stuff to identify those, understanding needs, and then visioning, what do we want to have in our community. It's really, from a wayfinding perspective, going to be more of an introduction, again, defining things, saying, here's what we're doing, here's maybe what we're not doing, and what we expect to get out of the process. In the second phase, then we'll take all that input and we'll develop the proposed network and identify priority projects and present that for feedback. And that's on the bicycle and pedestrian plan side. On the wayfinding side, this is where we will be working on the concept design. So here are a few alternative designs, getting feedback. Okay, here's the refined version of that, and talking as well about placement. Where do we put the signs? And that's on an individual street by street basis, kind of figuring out how close to the intersection and so forth, but also like what are the destinations we're trying to point people to. And then finally, in the third phase, it's reviewing the draft plan, reviewing the draft protocol for wayfinding, and getting that last round of input to help us to finalize the two.
And one thing I would add is I feel like, just in talking with Adam and putting together the scope, that the phase one wayfinding, though this plan is focused on non-motorized travel, could set up a framework or a policy that could apply to any wayfinding, regardless of what mode you're using.
All right, so that's sort of like what we're asking in each phase. We're going to talk now about the ways that we're going to be interacting with people. Okay, so we've put the phases now on the rows and the columns, identify the different tactics that we're going to use. So during the first phase, we have 2 technical advisory committee meetings and 1 community advisory committee meeting. Our first technical advisory committee meeting is actually tomorrow. We're going to be sort of working with the group, talking a lot about what we've talked about tonight, kind of an overview of the project scope, schedule. We're going to get into a little bit more nitty-gritty detail on some of these mechanical aspects of community engagement and communications. From a virtual and online engagement perspective, we're developing content for project website, materials for email blasts to announce the project, tell people here's what we're doing, here are how you can get involved, some social media content, and then developing an online poll and a survey. Now, we have in the plan overall several opportunities for online polls as well as a long form survey. And the poll we see as being an opportunity for sort of shorter questions to kind of gauge opinion, help people make sort of A/B decisions, sort of help us to guide direction there. And the long form survey would be about a little bit more detailed data collection. And then that in-person engagement aspect would be a kickoff ride. We're hoping to, in association with that first community advisory committee, plan let's get out on our bikes. Love for any of you to come that would like to, and go and just ride around and see what are, maybe we ride through some problem areas. We go see what's been done well, where are there gaps, where they're missing connections, and so forth. I think it's an opportunity for me to see things more through the perspective of the community. I think it's an opportunity for people that may live on one side of the city to see the other side of the city, to hear. And there will certainly be places where somebody thinks it's okay and somebody thinks it's not okay. And it's good to sort of get that difference in perspective. We're also planning, we don't have a particular location or time yet, but a pop-up event where we would have a booth table sort of thing at some sort of community event or out on the street to engage with people. So through a lot of this, you'll notice that we're shying away a little bit from the conventional meetings at City Hall at 6 p.m., 7 p.m. type of thing, and trying to get more out to where people are already going to be as a way to try to reach more.
One thing I think is important to point out, so the technical committee has a lot of the same people that are, a lot of the same professional staff that work at Iowa State, work with the school district, or are involved here through various city departments. So there's like planners, engineers, people who work with housing, people who work with parks. Every one of those professional staff that's in the TAC committee, I think, is uniquely set up to help Adam, because they all have their own different stakeholder groups, and they've all done projects, and they've all had to do public outreach. And so it's a really good resource when you look at the list of people in that technical committee who would be able to help us understand, here's all the ways that we've had success reaching out to the public for a park system plan review, or because we have a housing program we want people to get involved with. So all this technical staff, I think, really help, and we can discuss when we have in those meetings how we reach out to all the different populations in town.
So second phase here, you can see more community meetings, and we have a slide later to show our touch points with you as council. They don't appear on this slide. On the virtual engagement, this is that interactive web map. We see that being part of the second phase. Updates to the project website, another email, more social media, and then a couple of online polls. We don't exactly know at this point what's going to be in those polls. That's sort of the planning that happens and the evolution of the project as we get into it to understand what are those questions we may need to ask. On the interactive web map piece, where the intent with where this is located in the phasing is that we would have some preliminary network connections identified, and we would be presenting those in this online map, and people would be able to comment on them. So we have an open source platform that we've developed that can allow us to really add a lot of nuance in how we ask questions. So we've, for example, done things like we have a map of all the lines, and people can click on a line and they can comment on it, or they can click on it and they can say, I like it or I don't like it, or we could customize it and they could say, potato or marshmallow if we wanted to be crazy and say things like we can sort of add questions to that. So that can be a really powerful way to get input. We can also allow people to put points on the map to say, here's a challenge area or something that's been overlooked. As I said, we've got a lot of data already, so that's why we're wanting to shape this more as here is the preliminary recommendation and we want to get your feedback, as opposed to here's a blank map, tell us everything, because we've already gotten a lot of data there over the years. The in-person engagement then for the second phase, looking at the opportunity to do another group ride or perhaps walking tour, going to some particularly challenging locations, another pop-up event, one for the draft network. And when we say network, it's basically an identification of here are key sidewalk gaps, intersections that we see needing addressed, and the bike network itself. And then also a pop-up event for wayfinding. This would be an opportunity. Again, maybe we mock up some signs and have a couple designs for people to react to. We show them what it could look like and get their feedback on it.
In this, when Adam was talking about the network, and to the extent possible, we will use the comp plan. So we will look at the growth areas under that policy and what would a bike and walking network look like in those growth areas as well. So it's not just a retrofit plan. It will, and hopefully, focus heavily on growth as well. So you can start it off right if you think about it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and to that, and also the Complete Streets plan. We both are invested in the Complete Streets plan. Since we worked on it, we want to make sure that that's we're not overriding anything or throwing that out. So part of this is going to be, we need to do something on this street. There may be here's what would happen in the Complete Streets, ultimate vision for that street corridor. But if it's currently, the development's not happened yet, it's in an area of growth, maybe there's more of an interim treatment that can be identified or something like that. Okay, so the third phase, we have our advisory committee meetings, more website update and project emails and social media. So with the third phase, this is really, we have the draft plan. I envision that being published online for comment. So the website updates, the emails, the social media is going to be sort of like driving people to the website to look at the draft plan. And then in the in-person engagement, I'm not sure why we have website listed over there as well, but the big thing there is the draft plan open house. And so this is where we see having a large event. We have posters, maps of everything that's included in it. We will have, in theory, had the plan online available prior. So if people looked at it, they could come with additional questions. and it being an opportunity to kind of get last comments on things before we start to really finalize. And I envision that happening prior to coming back to you to say, okay, we've had the draft. Here's the comments we've gotten. Here are the tweaks we've made. So here's sort of our revised draft for you to look at, comment on, and then we can take from there and finalize.
And I
Bring it
believe
back to you for approval.
And I believe we had website on there because I know when we were talking about putting together the scope of the project that if people for time reasons, for travel reasons, for public health reasons, we want to try and replicate as much as possible of those public meetings in a digital format. So if people can consume them at a different time or so we're not missing anybody who doesn't necessarily have the time or wants to be able to go to an in-person meeting.
All right. So getting into the details then on the Community Advisory Committee, sort of some vital stats there on the left. Again, we want this to be diverse. We want to represent a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds. We are, this is intended to be more people that are in the public as opposed to technical staff members. That's what the Technical Advisory Committee is for. And we, again, want to make sure that we're getting perspectives both from people that walk, but also people that bike. I will say that it is always a challenge to find someone who identifies as a that's not hard. Finding someone that identifies as a pedestrian advocate is a challenge. So if anyone knows people, let us know. We'd love to have their names. We see this being a size of about 10 or 15 individuals. Damien and I were talking earlier about, the tenure on this thing. I think it may be okay to be flexible with if people cannot attend all of it. Maybe some people come on later, but trying to have some degree of consistency here. So as we have meeting after meeting, there can be some institutional knowledge developed through there. The prime ask is really September through December of this year. So that's 3 meetings. We see some additional input happening in winter and spring of 23, but see that being more virtual, sending emails, asking people to provide comments on draft work products and so forth at that point. So on the right-hand side of the screen is an identified list of sort of the types of people we're hoping to get involved in this advisory committee. You can read the list, but just in summary, it includes students, it includes people that are older, people that are younger, people with disabilities, people of color. If there are people that don't speak English at home, people that maybe don't have access to a vehicle, again, trying to identify all the different type of factors that may influence people's experiences in traveling around the city. Some people are going to be more dependent or less dependent on walking and biking.
And it's very possible that some of the representatives on this committee, obviously this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list,
Right.
But they could. And one of the goals might be that they could tick a couple of the bullet points there. So somebody might be able to cover more than one base. So it's not like the bullet point equals one person. It's more of the goal of this committee, in my opinion, when we're trying to put it together, was that they can look at the plan and the plan material and what's being developed and say essentially that I see something in this plan for me that's going to work versus I only see one type of facility. I don't use that facility. That's something that we want to avoid is we want to make sure that the plan speaks to like the abilities, the types of modes of travel, the connectivity, and so forth. So I think that was really the main goal of this committee is that we're getting all the feedback so that the plan is all in the right direction and we're putting enough options in there that we're getting what the expectation of the plan is, which is improving that walking and biking network. And if we miss a critical aspect of our community, I think that's where this committee could kind of set us straight or get us back on the right path.
Can you share how this committee is going to be formed? Like if people are interested in this, do they email you? Is it something you're looking to council to appoint? Is it something which is self-appointed? Or I'm just curious what you're thinking in terms of how it gets put together.
Well, I think a couple of things. One is it'll be a topic of discussion for our technical committee. So those are, like I said, professionals that deal, and they already have. So if there's an organization that's well established, we probably already have a point of contact for those groups.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start with those. and it's voluntary. So we'll reach out to them and say, hey, would you have somebody who would like to participate on this committee? Here's the commitment, here's the time. Obviously, I haven't put together the preamble for it. If there are representation who don't have a formal point of contact or a formal group, I think the technical committee can help kind of inform tool who we can reach out to, essentially through a brainstorming process. And for sure, if council knows or sees a group and you have somebody in mind, you can certainly send it to the city manager or directly to me, and it'll eventually get us to us working on the project.
I can anticipate that people would be interested in doing this. I'm just wondering about how you broadcast this out. Obviously, the answer is staff is going to be the one to be determining the committee makeup, and just want to make sure that there's good publication going out, an invitation, and who they should be directing. So if someone emails council, we say,
Sure.
it just goes to you or it goes to John or somebody, so they know that it's going to be considered essentially.
Absolutely. I think that method works, and maybe Adam can speak to other successful methods that you've done.
Yeah, I think recruiting for this is going to be important, and one potential approach is through existing email lists, sending out an invitation and having people fill out a brief survey or a Google form or something along those lines to sort of say, how many of these boxes do you tick? As Damien said, we're not expecting one person identifying with each of these. In fact, we would prefer to not have any one person being the only person that is an older adult or the only person who's an ISU student. We'd like to have multiple people that are ticking multiple boxes here.
So are you relying on the members of the Community Advisory Committee to gather feedback from their constituency groups?
That is not the intent. The
Okay.
intent is for them to bring their perspectives and
Okay.
bring their experiences and react to what we ask and what we show.
Okay.
We're not asking, you're an ISU student, we want you to represent all ISU students or anything along those lines.
Sure. I work in human services, so I tend to think that, or know that, some of the hardest populations to meet or to get feedback from are more vulnerable populations. And so I think, it will be difficult to find people like that who want to have time, et cetera, are able to serve on a committee. And so then how do we reach those groups of people if we don't necessarily have a good conduit through the Community Advisory Committee?
Yeah, I would agree with that. In particular, we had a constituent come, a year and a half ago that, was sight impaired, and council went ahead and put in some sidewalks so he could get to the Side-Ride, bus stop. You have down people with disabilities. I would think that someone who was visually impaired or really had, challenges from that standpoint, and also a wheelchair, that would be really valuable to kind of get their perspective too, and what are some of the challenges that they could see as well.
And how are you going to think about this language piece when you've mentioned that you want to find people who don't speak English at home? So how are you thinking about making sure that they are included in the conversation and building an environment where good dialogue can happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do have Sonia, who's on our team, speaks Spanish at home, and can certainly help to perform translations in meetings if that is needed for those individuals if they speak Spanish. We are limited in other languages in terms of people we have that speak, but I think it's important enough that if we have somebody who is a Hmong speaker at home that does not feel comfortable speaking in English, that we find some way to facilitate that involvement, because I think that'd be a really valuable voice to have in the room.
And the good thing is we can leverage a lot of those limited English proficiency processes that have happened through the MPO. I know that SciRide has a heavy focus on limited English proficiency, and I think for instance, for Mandarin, they've actually hit whatever the threshold for having to do dual publications. And as council knows, we have the big word. So if there are people who need information translated, the website's accessible. If they need information translated into another language, we have resources already that we can lean on. I think the challenge will be if there is someone who has a barrier where language English is the barrier, finding somebody who will commit to the amount of time and review this process. But we would have a lot of the federal guidance to land on too. So for instance, if we can't find somebody to participate, we know there are methods out there that have been developed. How do we address somebody who needs translation, who needs it in another language? And for instance, some of that guidance can show up in our wayfinding signs and so forth. So there's other visual ways to handle the barrier of English versus another language without necessarily putting things in words. So
You might just check with the Human Relations Commission too. We have a good diverse cross section,
Yeah.
and they may know of individuals who would be interested and who could be reached out. I know that Bryce could probably help, connect us to some Iowa State students that might be able to, meet a number of those, criteria. And Rachel, also, so that'd be great. I am curious, maybe it's a typo, but you show engagement period September to December, yet your phase 3 is showing your schedule is going into late March, early April. So I'm just curious, you said it's really 3 meetings primarily until December. So is that just oops, I forgot, we actually are going into March, or is it being bunched up, or can you help council understand that?
The intent so our thoughts with creating the schedule for the meetings was that by December, we would have identified the majority of the key recommendations and elements. From that point through the next several months, that's going to be a bit of a slow period, or it's going to appear to be a bit of a slow period as we're taking everything and we're developing it all out into the plan document itself. So during those September through December meetings is when we're asking, we're really coming and asking the critical questions. We're providing, presenting the concepts and saying, what do you think about this? Getting feedback on it. Here's a map. Does this look right? Here are kind of priorities we've identified. Do you agree with these things? Here are, strategies we're considering for implementation. Give us your feedback, all of that. And that's sort of the end of the meetings themselves. We then create the draft plan, and that's where that sort of asynchronous communication of like, hey, we want to give you as the advisory committee an opportunity to review the draft plan. Here's a link to it, PDF or something along those lines. Provide us with your written comments and so forth. So then it's less of a meeting, and it's just one, it's to try to reduce the number of meetings that people have on their calendars. Another is, at that point, it's hard to have one meeting to go through what might be a 100, 150 page document and get, go through discussion of all of it. So that was sort of the intent, is those September through December is the more hands-on physical engagement aspect. And then there's that asynchronous period that can come later.
Just trying to understand, because your schedule, part 1, slide shows, which I thought was really well done, showing the arrows going back and forth in the engagement. And it just seems that engagement for implementation strategies and draft and final plan would be critical to have your CAC, part and parcel of that. And I'm not trying to add meetings or change scope, but I think we have found that when you have meetings where everyone can get together and talk, you can bounce ideas off and get feedback. So I was just, if you're saying, no, that's not the way we're going to operate, we're going to defer to you as a consultant. You've done this before, but just as you can tell, I think council is very committed to and wants, robust. I'm sure Damien and John has communicated that to you in the procurement process. Very committed to community engagement and getting lots of feedback. So I just wouldn't want to see that cut off. And all of a sudden, we just wanted you to respond to something online. I think there's some value in at least a meeting to get, feedback. But I think that's my 2 cents worth.
I think one thing that I might add to that. So when we're talking and putting together the draft schedule that you see. Kind of the first half of that is really help educating our consultant on all the different experience of our community members, like we've been talking about. So all the public engagement process is that collection of experiences. And they're building on those, they're building on the standards, they're building on the data sets and performance measures that we'll be working into the plan. And then that kind of the latter half, my understanding and what most of these plans look like, is then the consultant and their team really kind of crunch all those numbers. And they take all that feedback and they take those experiences and start applying the development of the draft plan. It's a lot of professional minutia, if I can put it that way. So that's why it kind of looks like there's this dark period. It's because they're taking all that feedback, all that technical information, and making sense of it. And you're right. I think once they emerge from that process and they start to say, hey, here's what we heard, here's what we think solves those issues, does it make sense? And if we're way off base or if we need to do some correction there, like we'll have time and we'll be able to do that. And if that's re-engaging the community advisory committee to say, well, we thought one thing, looks like it ended up differently, we need to make an adjustment, we can do that.
I just know it's sometimes hard for someone to go in and want to do something online versus coming to a meeting and actually be active in the conversation. The last comment on your schedule, phase 2. Now I'm a wuss when it comes to cold weather. Okay, there's people that ride bikes like ramen, and their eyes free shut. So, but I see that the group ride is scheduled between November and January. And so is a pop-up event, a major pop-up event. And I just want to make sure, I think it's a great idea. I'm just trying to make sure that you have robust participation and then you don't have, just be like 20 degrees outside and all of a sudden Brahman's the only person that and the Ames Bicycle Coalition, the only ones that showing up, because I think it's a great process. So can you just comment on that too, how you would handle that? Because it is, I understand timing is of the essence and you got to get things going, but.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We, in initially developing the engagement plan, we had actually had the second phase as primarily virtual, primarily online, just in consideration of that. And, I don't know how many public meetings you've tried to have in December or January, but no one's going to come to them. So it was kind of the turnout's going to be not ideal. So it was in consideration of that. And as we talked about it, we said, let's leave open the possibility that we have some opportunities to do something that would allow us to get out. Maybe it's not a bike ride. Maybe it's one of those opportunities to go and let's look at some intersections. Let's get, grouped together and go out and walk some intersections or see some intersections and see what's going on. Let's go out and see what winter maintenance is like. I mean, if we want to change our mode share, we're going to have to make it to where people can walk and bike during the winter. Let's go kind of see what's happening out there. So that's one possibility. On the pop-up event, again, I think if there are any sort of festivals, if there's, anything sort of leading up into Thanksgiving, like a winter festival, a holiday lights sort of thing that may happen, those could be opportunities as well to get out and engage with people. And we might have to get some budget for some hot cocoa and hand warmers to hand out or something along those lines, but that could be a possibility.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I hope that gives an opportunity to think sort of creatively, because some people aren't in a position economically to be on social media. They're not website savvy. They are not going to get the message in the ways that we're talking about. So those pop-up events might be an opportunity to get in with some of those other populations where they are, instead of thinking that they're going to come to us. And so I think it's exciting that that's built in.
Yeah.
Mayor, can I make an observation and ask a question?
Absolutely.
Actually, Anita, thank you for raising that issue about people not necessarily having the technology aptitude or perhaps the wherewithal to have access to technology. My observation was that the outreach seems to be very heavily loaded toward virtual and online engagement. And so while I appreciate that, I sort of feel like we're going to be getting the same people who typically give us input. And so I would love to see us having more opportunities for face-to-face pop-up engagement, not the standard come to the city hall and meet at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night when you might actually be working. So I'm hoping that we can find some more creative ways to bolster the in-person engagement for those people who are least likely to give us the input on social media and the website, but are most likely to need the sidewalk connectivity in the community. And so a follow-up question to that is, how are you going to measure whether you have succeeded in getting enough participation from those underrepresented groups that we find so hard to engage? Because it seems to me this is a great opportunity for us to engage those citizens in a process that is important to their quality of life. And I would like to feel that we have a means of assessing whether we've succeeded in reaching them. And if we haven't, retooling a bit and finding a way to get that input that might be lacking.
So we do generally, at least for surveys or questionnaires, make sure to collect demographic information. And that's one way we can see the representation of who's participating. With our online map input, we have the opportunity there to require demographic information or to make it optional, depending on your opinion or your preference, rather, before people are able to engage with the map. With in-person events, it's, I think, for a variety of reasons, problematic to assume anyone's demographics based on their appearance. We can certainly ask people in surveys if they're willing, or hand out questionnaires if they're willing to indicate that, but that's one way we can record. I think we can also take some factor in regarding where those events occur, what the nature of the event that maybe we're tagging onto. If we're tagging onto some sort of festival, is there a community organization? Are there particular community groups that tend to attend those events, as ways of saying, maybe we're not tracking income and age and ethnicity here, but we know if this is in this neighborhood, or if it's this type of event, that it's getting us more toward people that have not historically been as involved in some of these input opportunities, that being a possibility. I think, I agree that being out with people and the pop-up events are really good ways to engage. It is a challenge to get proportional participation in public processes. I have been involved with processes that have been incredibly intentional and have put hundreds of thousands of dollars toward boots on the ground engagement, and we still have come up short. I think it was definitely a worthwhile effort. It is difficult, and I think part of it has to do with I think the comment earlier about the most vulnerable populations, they have the most going on, and they may not be interested in taking the time to fill out a survey. Like, it just may not be the top priority for some people. And I think with that mindset, we still try, we still put the effort in there, but we, take that, that reality and take that into consideration. We're sort of judging the success rate there.
Okay.
I had just a couple other quick things. A lot of people now are using SciRide with their bikes, so they'll load their bikes on and then use their bikes at a different part of the trip. Is there a plan to visit with SciRide about the way in which their riders are bringing their bikes on and use bikes as part of that trip planning?
Yes. So we have people from SciRide that are on the technical advisory committee as well.
Okay.
So there will be ample opportunities to talk about topics such as that. I know that they have a pretty good amount of data about who's getting on and where they're going and so forth. And I think they may have data on
They do. Yep.
bikes on racks, how often people are using their bikes on the racks as well. So we can certainly talk with them about that and see what understanding.
Yep, that'd be helpful. And then on the wayfinding, we used to use these things, big pieces of paper, and they folded up into little things. Rachel, do you know what these are?
A map.
There we go. But, and I'm sort of being facetious, but people, Rachel generation below, they don't use these things, right? And so everything's done using these. So I'm curious, would we think about some kind of app? So I'm turned around, I don't know where I am in Ames. I pop up my app and I see exactly where I am. I need to go to campus. I wonder if young people are necessarily going to be using the same kind of tools, and do other cities make use of apps or other mapping technology to help with the wayfinding? In other words, are we limiting ourselves just to physical signs?
There are certainly places where or agencies that have created their own apps for bike routing, and especially in places where there are some unique topographical challenges or whatnot that, you can input how steep of a hill are you willing to go up when you're biking, which is something that like Google Maps or alternatives don't have. My question there on a custom app would be, how likely are people to use that rather than using something like Google Maps? I think there's a comfort with known apps, and that said, I know that there are opportunities to provide input and edit Google Maps, and so maybe there's some
I like that
space
idea.
there to like just enhance the data sets that are out there and the apps that people are already using.
Yeah, I'm not meaning that we would have to necessarily create our own app, but just the idea of using these. I mean, I just think these are so prolific that we would want to use things like Google Maps. And the final point,
We have a very talented GIS group, as you know, so
Yeah.
that's something that we could work on potentially in-house, at least have conversations with them and see if that's something they could develop.
yeah, really cool. And then just another good source of data, our running groups in Ames. We have a group called Team Vardo that I run with, but also Iowa State has a nice running club. And so we heavily utilize these trails. And so we have experience with lots and lots of trails. And so there'll be some very good data points that they would offer, I think.
I had a question about how the size of this community committee was chosen. We have a similar community committee for our climate action plan, and that's 27 people to kind of make sure that not one person is the representative for an entire group. With 10 to 15, I know we want some overlap, but do you anticipate we'll get all of this proposed representation? Would it potentially grow if we find that we can't get this representation in a small group? Kind of how is that decided on?
Yeah, so 10 or 15 is not a hard and set number. It's more about trying to keep it a little bit more manageable. I mean, I think ideally you'd want to have a group where everyone can remember everyone else's first name, where you can all fit in one room, if need be, and so forth. So that's kind of the idea there. Our experience has just been that groups of that size are a little bit more manageable, and then you feel like you're less of you're sitting in a classroom and more you're part of a body of people that are trying to work together towards things. That's just been what our experience has been. Again, maybe the number is higher, maybe it's lower, but that is sort of what we've typically aimed for. So there's no magic to it. That's just sort of, having done this a few times, it's kind of where we've landed. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And, I think I will say, I don't think we're going to hit every single one of these, and we're not going to have multiple people on every single one of these. I think the goal is really to make sure that we end up with a group that we feel is diverse and representative of a variety of perspectives, even if we're not ticking every single box. And honestly, we could probably, if we thought about it, add 10 more bullets to here to describe different characteristics and experiences as well.
All right, any closing questions before you move on to, you have one more slide, I think, to go over.
Okay.
Most important one.
I'm sorry?
The most important one.
Most important one, yes. So as Damien mentioned, this is hitting on kind of the major touch points with you, where I foresee kind of lengthier discussions such as this, and we're in the middle of or toward the end of that first one where we've gone through what is our process, talked about goals and engagement strategy. Our plan then is to come back to you in November and tell you, okay, here's what we've heard through our input so far. Summarize with some statistics and probably some charts or something, and saying maybe these are the top 3 or 4 things we're hearing. This is what people are saying is the highest priority, et cetera. We also at that point will come back and sort of define user types. And this is where, we want to come and say, there's a variety of people, there's a spectrum of people that walk and bike. And what we're hearing is there's maybe 3 or 4 sort of community profiles or primary types of people that we've heard from that we need to make sure we're meeting. And so one might be, families with young children. That could be one. And so when we think about biking and walking for families with young children, these are some of the considerations or some of the areas that we need to prioritize. One could be, different things like that. And that'll help to establish a planning framework. And this may be talking about hierarchies of networks. Maybe we come back and we propose to you like a spine network that is a select number of routes. And we say, these are going to be, the Cadillac corridors, and we want to do it this way. Or maybe it's something completely different, but some sort of like framework of saying, okay, based on what we've learned, we think this is the strategy we should take. From a wayfinding perspective, that's where we'll bring you and show you the sign concepts, the types of destinations, and how we're looking at prioritizing the routes, which is, route prioritization is kind of like, what do we put where on a sign, and when do we have to leave a destination off because no one wants to read a sign with 15 destinations on it. We need to keep it at 3 or 4, that sort of thing. In April, we come back with the draft plan review. Again, the intent here is to have tested this and presented it and had our public open house. So we come back and say, okay, here's the draft plan. Here's what we heard. We heard resounding support, or we heard, people want to see a change in this area or something along those lines so that you can make some decisions. We'll similar to that time, present to you the wayfinding protocol and get your feedback on that. Then we'll go back away. We'll finalize things, bring it back to you at a later point, or maybe Damien brings it back to you. We'll see how that works and say, here it is. Here's the final for final comment, review, approval type of thing. And as Damien was alluding to or mentioning, we foresee updates about every month or 2 in between, whether that be a memo saying, okay, here's our working goals and vision. Let us know if you have comments. Here's what the map is looking. Whatever kind of key touch points seem to make sense that we think would be good for you to get some eyes on and give any direction on prior to moving forward.
Hey, final questions? Gloria, any questions or comments? Anybody else? When can council expect like a summary of your summary written up of what we talked about, like by 2 or 3 weeks or end of the month, that kind of summarizes what you captured, what we talked about? I presume that you're going to do that as part of your process of,
Mm-hmm.
I think we talked about a lot of really good things. I think it's nice to kind of capture that and make sure that, at least for me, it's very helpful to see that and track after that. So,
I think within 2 weeks, probably need to take this. As we said, we're meeting with the technical advisory committee tomorrow. We're going to kind of go through a similar type of thing. So depending on what comes out of that, there may be a combined sort of summary of during my 24-hour period here in Ames. Here's what we heard, or maybe they're separate or something along those lines.
And at what point will we get some budget? Like, is that at the end of the process at all, or we'll get a plan and then later there will be numbers that will go with various options? How will that work?
Well, what I'll add to it is that, so early on when we're talking about the structure of this plan, it really is to try and take a lot of the same or similar process from the long-range transportation plan, except without the limit of budget. So one of the things, like once that the middle meeting where you're looking at the planning frame network, somewhere in there, we will be giving Tool information on how we do our capital budgeting. What our typical budgeting levels are, what our typical investment for this type of infrastructure is, what it looks like forecasted going forward. So we'll give them essentially a framework on what council's policies are for infrastructure funding. And if you remember the long-range plan process, you take like construction costs and forecast them out, you take revenues and you forecast them out, and then you look at, well, based on these forecasts, the financial forecasts, here's how much of the plan can be done and how often. So when you get to the draft plan, it's going to have, I don't know what we'll call it, but some kind of like, yes, a financial plan with all that forecasted information. We work with our finance department to make sure that the numbers that we're using are accurate and follow the process that council has set forth. And obviously you're very familiar with what that looks like for the CIP.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Adam, Damien, John. Good meeting and appreciate the kickoff and look forward to seeing this thing move forward.
Appreciate all the questions and the input and just the level of interest you all clearly are showing in this project. It's very encouraging. So
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to item number 2 on our agenda, ladder truck refurbishment, change order number 1.
This doesn't sound as fun as this one was.
Do council have any questions for staff? And I don't know, is Brian or Steve, can you answer any questions?
I can answer any questions you have.
Or do you want to just give a quick summary of it? Or
Yeah, Brian can. You like one?
If you ask really tough questions, Rich is sitting by his cell phone. You'll recall that we recently purchased a new tower truck that will serve as our frontline apparatus, replacing our ladder 3, truck 3 that has been in operation for about 2 decades now. When we purchased the tower truck, we sent truck 3 to the manufacturer for refurbishment, and we included $125,000 in the CIP for that refurbishment. We have the shop that is doing the refurbishment has conducted its inspection of the truck and has found quite a few components that are worn and quite a bit of corrosion on the frame and suspension components and other components of the ladder truck. And so in order to achieve our goal of returning truck 3 to the fire department's fleet of apparatus in a reserve role for another 15 years, we believe that it is worthwhile to approve this change order, which will add an additional $142,608 to the contract to essentially completely dismantle the truck, address the corrosion, replace worn parts, and put it back together. We think this will take about 5 months to complete, and at the end of it, we'll have a truck that we think can handle the conditions, the stressful conditions that we put it through for that period of time. We would use some savings from vacant positions that we've had and other savings in the fire department's 21-22 operating budget, in addition to some savings from the the Tower 1 CIP project and the original $125,000 in the truck 3 refurbishment CIP in order to finance this.
questions?
Steve, remind us, I feel like I should know this by now. How do we buy fire trucks?
We usually buy fire trucks through their general obligation, essential corporate purpose. So they're so expensive, we don't depreciate like we do other vehicles.
Right.
So we, part of your debt service fund, it's essential corporate purpose.
We don't do any kind of sinking fund for these. We just completely finance them.
Yeah, so I said it would be very expensive blow to the budget if we tried to depreciate them over a 15-year period. $1.5 million would really be a blow to it. So we try to layer them in with the rest of the debt with streets and bike paths and all those kind of things. So we have a debt service that goes up slowly, but we try not to get big blips.
Okay, thanks.
What you're really doing is you're paying about $250,000 for, a new truck, as you know, costs $1.4 million. It has pumper capabilities on it, so it can be used out on the fire scene too. And right now, we have a lot of high-rise buildings at the university and other places, apartments. And if our frontline unit goes down, we don't have a backup or reserve. So we have to call on other cities to respond. In all other cases, we have pumper trucks that, we have some backups and reserves for when they go out. So it'll be the first time we have a reserve unit, but I think it's worth the investment.
Further questions? All right, entertain a motion.
Move alternative 1.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion? Roll call.
Thank you.
Aye.
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 Thank you. All right, now we have disposition of communications to council. There are 4 items. And it was my understanding, item 1, email from Irv Klaus regarding developer's request for conservation overlay. That was already,
Yes, he's asked for a waiver, and actually the council denied the waiver, and it's sending it through the process of review by city staff. So I think it's in conjunction with what he's recommending.
item 2 is email from Tammy Ryan regarding return of Visha. And I think you all saw the response from Dr. Winterstein's office that way. I thought was, very well done. So I think this is just take under advisement. Email from Paul Shao, item number 3 regarding American Eagle Memorial honoring Dan and Sue Zafrano. That's been
It's already been referred to, and Keith, Parks and Rec Department, is following up on it.
And then number 4 is the letter from the Ames Bicycle Coalition, which I believe all of us took into consideration in the conversation tonight. So
Could we make sure that that is also given to Damien and the project team for the bike ped plan?
make a motion.
This letter, you mean?
Yeah, I would move that we provide this letter from the Bicycle Coalition to the project team.
Second.
Okay, those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Motion carried. All right, council comments. Bryce, anything tonight?
Just that school starting on Monday. So hopefully we will have, now that the local affairs committee can kind of actually meet, we can start figuring out some things to do.
Looking forward to our fall joint city council student government session, hopefully in October, huh?
Mhm.
Hopefully. All right, Bronwyn,
Nothing for me.
Rachel.
I was just going to say welcome back to ISU students and hope everyone has a safe and very respectful welcome back weekend.
Nothing for me.
Nothing. Thanks.
Tim.
Just as a reminder, City Council will be taking up the location of the Fitch Family Aquatic Center in our meeting on August 23rd.
Gloria. Gloria, any comments tonight?
No, nothing for me, thanks.
All right. Okay. Mark, next item is a closed session, and does council justification to go into closed session?
Yes, Iowa Code Section 21.51C allows the council to go into closed session to discuss matters in litigation.
Is there a motion to go in closed session?
So moved.
Second.
All right, roll call.
Aye.
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 All right, we will be entering into closed session. Thank you. All right, back in open session, and I would entertain a motion to authorize a settlement agreement as per the attached settlement agreement and release document.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Roll call.
Aye.
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 Aye. Thank you. All right.
Thank
I'd
you.
entertain a motion to adjourn.
If we adjourn.
Second.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Aye.